Not to worry, everyone. Things are, of course, totally normal in Canada these days. The federal government has only signaled its intent to make thought crimes illegal in this country. If the arresting of political dissidents wasn't enough, if the outlawing of peaceful protest wasn't enough, if the seizure of private assets and money for opposing the government wasn't enough, and of course, if the censoring of the internet wasn't enough to convince you that Canada is no longer a free and democratic country, maybe this will. The release of an interim report by the federal government on unmarked graves proposes to make it illegal to engage in what they call residential school denialism. What exactly is residential school denialism? Well, despite the report being over 180 pages, definitions for such a thing just didn't seem to make the cut. I wonder why. In their words, the federal government wants to impose civil and criminal sanctions on those that engage in denialism. That means you could be fined for having bad thoughts, but as the government would surely prefer, you could also rot in a jail cell for having bad thoughts. The Attorney General was delighted at these findings, and he stated on the record that he would be in favor of outlawing denialism. I'll break it down for you. You either believe that Canada is an evil, genocidal country guilty of crimes against humanity, or you'll rot in a jail cell long enough until you believe that Canada is an evil, genocidal country guilty of crimes against humanity. That's where we're at right now in the Great White North. Every day it feels as though Canada is straying further away from the country that we were promised as children and newcomers to this land, and closer to the country that Justin Trudeau most admires, the basic dictatorship of China. Drop a like in the video, help us out by subscribing to the True North YouTube channel, and the comment question for the episode is this: what will it take to restore the basic principles of freedom and democracy back into Canada? Let me know in the comments, and let's get into it. Kimberly Murray, the woman appointed by the federal government to the role of independent special interlocutor on unmarked graves, not to be mistaken with independent special rapporteur, also a fake position, has called on the government to make it illegal to engage in denialism, to make thought crimes illegal in Canada. And like anyone who's proud of her findings and recommendations to the government, she released this report on Friday afternoon. In her 180-page report, she makes no mention of what denialism actually means. But she does go on to say that engaging in denialism is, quote, violence. Words are violent, according to Kimberly Murray. As the Canadian Press reports on the findings, Murray raised concerns about increasing attacks from denialists who challenge communities when they announce the discovery of possible unmarked graves. This violence is prolific, the report said, and takes place via email, telephone, social media, op-eds, and, at times, through in-person confrontations. As the report directly states, denialism is a uniquely non-Indigenous problem. It therefore requires non-Indigenous people to actively work to counter denialism and to create and implement strategies to do so. Urgent consideration should be given to legal mechanisms to address denialism, including the implementation of both civil and criminal sanctions. So it's quite clear. Residential school denialism, from Kimberly Murray's own report, is not denying the existence of residential schools. It also includes denying the findings and claims of unmarked burials across the country. We all know that not a single body has been exhumed, not a single bone has been discovered in any of the claims of unmarked graves outside of residential schools. But in Canada, according to Kimberly Murray, the independent special interlocutor, along with David Lametti, it would be a crime to deny that that exists, despite the fact that it doesn't exist. Here's what Canadians had to say on Twitter about this report. So we're going to make it a crime to question any absolute facts advanced by government authorities and have an opposing opinion. What kind of oppressionist country are we becoming? Critical thinking is a must in today's environment of mis and disinformation. A great way to change people's minds is to provide enough evidence to do so. It's not the job of government to dictate which opinions are correct. Stop propagandizing us and pushing for totalitarianism. Enough already. And this comment I really wanted to highlight on the show from a user called Cardinal Wayne. No, that is criminal censorship. My dad attended a residential school and he would not have supported anything like that. All of this started in the spring of 2021 when the Kamloops to Secwépemc Reserve claimed to have found the remains of 215 children buried at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. The former newspaper and now leftist propaganda rag, the New York Times, without doing any actual journalism, jumped on this story and titled it as Mass Graves of Indigenous Children. From that point on, Indigenous reserves and bands across the country would make similar reports of findings of unmarked graves. You had the Washington Post, for example, again without doing any journalism, claimed that 751 unmarked graves containing the bodies of Indigenous children were found at the Cowessess First Nation at the site of the former Marival Residential School. Despite the sensational claims from news outlets across the country claiming that 751 unmarked graves were found, the Cowessess First Nation from the outset claimed that they didn't discover any graves at all. Crosses and headstones at pre-existing cemeteries had gone missing under disputed circumstances decades earlier. The Cowessess chief, Cadmus Delorme, even told CBC News that the findings were from an existing Roman Catholic cemetery. The truth is, all of these claims of unmarked graves and burials were made with ground-penetrating radar technology. Not a single body has been found in any excavation attempts. But that didn't stop almost every single news outlet from reporting on mass graves being discovered across the country. However, excavations have taken place. In 2021, a series of 21 excavations in Edmonton were undertaken to try and find the remains of Indigenous children. As this CBC article writes, 13 spots flagged by ground-penetrating radar were dug up earlier this summer. Over the past 2 days, another 21 such anomalies were uncovered, but only found debris. And earlier this year, the National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools, Missing Children and Unmarked Burials refused to work with the International Commission on Missing Persons, a Hague-based organization designed to help governments with identifying missing persons and exhuming mass graves. The reason why the National Advisory Committee refused the assistance of this Hague-based group was because they were non-Indigenous. Perhaps it was because this Hague-based organization might uncover the fact that the claims used to label Canada as genocidal are complete nonsense. We all know what actually happened in the spring of 2021. First Nations leaders, with the help of the Canadian legacy media, the international media, and even the federal government, would make reported findings of unmarked graves at the site of former residential schools using ground-penetrating radar, which uncovers nothing at all, and claim that this is evidence of the slaughter of Indigenous children. That Canada is guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity, and therefore we must enter into a national state of mourning. And that is exactly what Canada did. Because of the claims of unmarked graves being found at residential schools, despite there being zero evidence to back up these claims, our country descended into chaos. 71 churches in Canada were attacked because of these claims that have not been proven. Several of these churches were completely razed to the ground. Most of these churches, by the way, served Indigenous Canadians. All the while, the federal government did nothing as a national attack on Christians took place across the country. Even worse, Justin Trudeau's former principal secretary, Gerald Butts, made excuses for the persecution of Christians across the country during that summer of 2021, saying that it was understandable that these churches were being razed to the ground. The Prime Minister ordered all flags across the country to be flown at half-mast for months in a prolonged national state of mourning for claims that were unfounded and unproven. Not only that, on Canada Day in 2021, a statue of Canada's Mother of Confederation, our first head of state, Queen Victoria, was brutally torn down on the grounds of the Manitoba legislature. And also, a statue of Queen Elizabeth II, our head of state at the time, was also torn down that same day outside of the legislature, while sitting Canadian MPs cheered it on social media. Also, a statue of Egerton Ryerson, a man lauded by the First Nations community in his day, given the honorary name of Chichok by an Ojibwe chief for spending a year living with the Ojibwe Cree Nation. His statue was also brutally torn down as politicians stayed silent. This is to say nothing at all over the countless attacks and vandalism against John A. Macdonald statues across the country. City councils and towns voted to remove John A. Macdonald statues because we had to engage in a serious state of mourning, despite there being zero evidence to prove any of the claims. If denialism of these unfounded claims of unmarked graves is violent, and as the Attorney General says needs to be outlawed, well, there are quite a few people in this country that need to stand trial for daring to question the narrative peddled by the federal government. Let's start with the 61 historians who are members of the Canadian Historical Association that signed an open letter criticizing that same organization for saying that there is a scholarly consensus among historians that Canada engaged in genocide. In this open letter, these 61 historians make mention of the fact that criticizing the narrative being peddled by the federal government is already enough to jeopardize one's career in academia. What about famed Indigenous author and journalist Richard Wagamese? In 2008, he published a story in the Calgary Herald titled, "The Good Side of the Residential School Story is Valid Too." As a journalist since 1979, he writes, "I have heard people credit residential schools with the foundation for learning that allowed them to pursue successful academic careers. My mother has never spoken to me of abuse or any catastrophic experience at the school. She only speaks of learning valuable things that she went on to use in her everyday life, things that make her life more efficient, effective, and empowered." How about Dr. Chile Obo Asuji, the former president of the International Criminal Court? He told band chiefs in Edmonton at the National Gathering of Unmarked Burials that there was no pathway to the International Criminal Court for the situation of the historical Indian residential school system in Canada. What about the award-winning Indigenous playwright Thompson Highway? Highway described his residential school years as 9 of the happiest years of his life. What about Leonard Marchand, the first Indigenous Member of Parliament and Indigenous Cabinet Minister? In his book, he writes that they meant well by us, they genuinely cared about us, and they all did their duty by us as they saw fit. Dr. Ian Gentles, a distinguished professor of history at Tyndale University, whose writing provided a lot of evidence for this video, would most certainly be standing trial for the crime of denialism if this government had its way. Also, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, they buried positive memories from Indigenous Canadians about their time at residential schools. Would these people be charged for the crime of denialism? What about Lillian Kennedy, who attended the Fort Alexander Residential School? In the TRC report, she is quoted as saying that she enjoyed being at the residential school. "I think I learned lots from the nuns that were there, and I got along with everybody." What about Alphonsine McNeely? She says that on the weekends, the students at the Roman Catholic school at Aklavik used to go for school picnics. Then we'd play outside, we'd go sliding, we'd play all kinds of games on the lake, and we just have fun. A woman named Geraldine Shingoose is also quoted in the TRC report. She says that she has fond memories of the Lestock School principal. One of the things I wanted to share about Father Desjardins was that I really liked him, she says. He treated us good. He was the principal of the school, and that I know he meant in his heart to take care of the kids. Just the staff that were there didn't. So I wonder if these 3 women, who are quoted as having fond memories of the residential school time, which apparently is genocidal, would be tried for the crime of denialism. You know who wouldn't be tried for denialism in Canada? Every single member of Parliament in Ottawa, including the Conservatives, who unanimously passed a motion calling the residential school system genocide. Making it illegal to question that for which we don't have the evidence to support is not just wrong, it's completely absurd. And when the government decides to ban free speech and criminalize thought, I have no doubt in my mind that that government is not telling the truth. All right, everyone, that's going to do it for us today on the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Harrison Faulkner, and this is Ratio.